So yes, today I will be talking about money shots, and I will be explaining a bit more in detail what that is. And I will also try to speak more slowly than I usually do, especially to help the interpreters back there as well. A few words about the book that Christian mentioned, which is about speaking subjects in documentary media. And it is divided into different parts, and I'm trying to get at different aspects, perhaps, that I feel is a bit underdeveloped in documentary theory, and has to do with the anonymous interview, that is, when we don't see the face of the people speaking. I'll be discussing, for instance, what Christian mentioned, the direct address, what it means when the person is looking straight into the camera, and how that ties in with the return gaze from fiction film, which of course is a taboo in fiction and has all the bearings of reflexivity. Money shots had to do with the speaking subject in great affect. That is, when the person being interviewed, the person speaking, is somehow losing his or her composure, losing control, and what happens to the conventions of the conversation, the interview, and what happens to this, very convention-dictated, but yet quite delicate contract of documentary and audience of documentary work. But I will be starting, before I talk about all these people crying today in documentary media, I'll be just giving a few media historical comments that will lead up to how I understand the speaking subject and why I talk about the speaking subject instead of the talking head. Okay. The advent of sound film, that was at the time, the late 1920s, was never referred to as sound film, but as talkies. People were not primarily interested in listening to sound effects, music, or birds singing in the trees. They wanted to hear people talk. The human voice was central to the development of this new technology, and was, the great success of this new format was much because the human voice. This coincided with the development of John Grierson's thought of what documentary film can be in society and the documentary movement. And of course, John Grierson, the British theorist of documentary film, in fact, he's the one that coined the phrase documentary film for the first time, also placed great emphasis on the voice. For him, of course, the voice-over rather than the spoken voice of the subjects in the film. And also, this also historically lined up with radio culture, which had already established itself as a purveyor of information by the human voice alone. Now, as these things move together, we're starting to get a notion of how documentary would make the human voice so central to its expression, and how it organized information, how it, structured narratives, etc. As radio culture persisted and gelled with, the advent of television in the 1950s, the talking head was very much established as the norm for this new medium. And we often hear that television and film are intimately related, but in fact, television draws almost everything from radio culture. Almost all the first television celebrities were borrowed from radio, etc. And if we watch television today, it still relies mostly on the human voice. And if you want to make this experiment, I often do with my students, you turn up the volume of your TV and you walk into the next room, and you can understand pretty much everything that goes on. You don't really need the image as much as you think you do in television. And if you reverse that, push mute on your remote control and try to follow the simplest program that goes on, and you will understand nothing. So what we have here, the talking head, is an extension of a type of radio personality, a voice personality, that is then inserted into the audiovisual framework. Now, theories on the talking head, as it was referred to, or the interview, was kind of late in the coming, and it was not until the 1970s and 1980s when academia went through this, perhaps what could be called the linguistic term, in which the written and the spoken word was central. And if we today read much of what it was written about, the talking head in the interview at this time, it is very much focused on the linguistic statement. Right? It is very much, focused on language and expressions. And what I will be talking about is many of the things that sort of escapes language, that exceeds it. The philosopher Roland Barthes talked about the grain of the voice. When he talked about the grain of the voice, he talked about all the information that goes into the human voice that does not necessarily carry linguistic or formal information. It has to do with gender, class, whether the people speaking is a smoker, are they having a cold, do they have a speech impediment, are they stuttering or something like this. All this information that goes into the speaking subject that has nothing to do with the absolute linguistic context of the statement. Right? So this movement from the talking head to what I call the speaking subject has everything to do with broadening the image, not to talk about the head, but also talk about other things that has to do with the interview situation, about what the contexts of them, which could be cultural, social, and technical. I will return to this. So, the money shot. This term is, of course, borrowed from the world of pornographic film. And a fact that I was reminded of this morning when I wanted to print this version of the paper. And the hotel I'm staying in has this sort of safety blockage for family usage of the computer system in the hotel. So all computers shut down when I wanted to print it and said, no, we cannot print this material. So regardless of what computer I went to in the hotel, none of them would print it. So. The money shot in pornographic context, of course, refers to the ever crucial male ejaculation shot. It is probably that phrasing that blocked it. But whereas this feature has not always been central to pornographic film, it is safe to say that from the 1970s and onwards, it's probably the most privileged shot of the genre as a whole. And as many Marxist and feminist commentators have observed, the term not only contains its own comment about the all-important commercial and capitalist aspects of the genre, it also visualizes the male perspective. The money shot is self-explanatory. It brings closure and it organizes the film into scenes. It needs no further in-depth explanation, that is. My own use of the term will come closer to how the sociologist Laura Grindstaff uses it in her book, The Money Shot, Trash, Class, and the Making of TV Talk Shows. Now, Grindstaff analyzes different aspects of the production procedures for shows like Jerry Springer, Ricky Lake, and the generations of talk shows that follows. The money shot in this context is not only a particular type of visualization, but more importantly, it is the emotional outburst. It is the confrontational climax of the show. Grindstaff argues that the money shot is the moment wherein the body escapes volition, wherein the privates take over and are in excess of the otherwise public norms of bodily and emotionally restraint. Like the orgasmic shot of the money shot of the pornographic film, the money shot of talk shows make visible the precise moment of letting go, of losing control, of surrendering to the body and its animal emotions. It is the loss of the civilized self that occurs when the body transcends social and cultural control, revealing human behavior in its raw rather than cooked form. So what we see here is the tension between the presupposed oppositions that are allowed to be articulated and visualized in these moments, in the money shot. The first and perhaps most obvious one is the tension between the idea of the rational and controlled mind on the one hand, and the unruly and emotional body on the other. A second set of tension, closely linked to the first, ties to the notion of gender and class. To these, the lower classes and women, perhaps also children, are to be associated with the emotional body, while the educated middle class and men are associated more with the coolly observing, distanced intellect. Thirdly, and this is also important, is the tension between the public and the private. What is offered in a money shot is an act that most of us reserve for private moments, perhaps in a domestic setting. Now, before I continue, I want to show a brief clip from a film from 1920. It is Victor Sjöström's The Phantom Chariot from 1920. I'm going to show you the last few minutes of that film. In the film, for those of you who have not seen it, we see a rumbler, an alcoholic, a chronic liar, and an abuser, David Holm, played by the director Victor Sjöström, who redeems himself towards the end of the film and wants to be a good person. I want to screen that scene. Let's see here. It goes on for just a few more minutes after that. Now, this clip tells us several things. It informs us a bit about the way crying can be seen to function socially. And it's also about how crying, in some cases, is viewed as an index of truthfulness. And this, of course, are aspects that I will return to. We should also consider here how crying on film is also tied to the notion of melodrama and the melodramatic imagination. And the fact that we have entire genres of film, particularly in certain historical periods, that have no other or few other goals than to make people cry and feel this instant identification through the crying person that we are actually watching. And this complex bond between experiencing the pain of the interviewed subject is also something that goes to the heart of some of these questions. So, let's see if I can. Now, these moments that Grindstaff talks about, these money shots, have become hallmark of the genre of talk shows, of course. It is central to its claim to authenticity, as well as to its negative reputation. On the one hand, therefore, it highlights and underlines that what is happening is real, quote unquote. And yet, it is exactly this type of realness, of people crying, fighting, losing control, is what makes it trashy, right? Its negative reputation. And here's an interesting tension. According to the producer, the more emotional and volatile the guests and the audience members are, the more real and the more ordinary they are. One producer for a talk show says, I quote, "What matters is the money shot, and virtually all production efforts, choosing topics, finding, interviewing, and rehearsing guests, coaching audience members, are geared towards maximizing the probability of its display." That is, the person losing control is a goal in itself. Right? And for all the negativity and for all the bad reputation that these talk shows have, in my findings when I study and look for scenes in a whole lot more serious documentary media, I find a similar preoccupation with the person crying. That documentary has within it a strive, a will towards this money shot. And there are entire conventions around this. We can look at films in anything from investigative journalism for TV to monumental and important works like Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, through history of documentary, that when a subject starts crying, it is obvious to everybody on the set that something important is happening. Someone is now losing control. Filters are being ripped from their otherwise so controlled stance and what they're saying. But also, there are some technical aspects that most documentary filmmakers seem to adhere to. For instance, you zoom in on the tear. When someone starts crying, you move in closer. You do not want the viewer to miss the fact that the subject is actually crying, and that this tear, the visualization of the tear, constructs a different air around, a different sense of credibility around the people talking. Hence this money shot. Sometimes a person crying, a person losing control can be held, for up to 45 seconds or to a minute. Nothing is being said. No action is being portrayed. No objects is being showed to the camera. The object itself is the crying. It's the act of sort of losing your composure. When a troubled memory or the horrible news or something else is brought up through the speaking subject that is so affected and embodied by that it can no longer not cry. I would also like to mention Jane Mill's book, The Money Shot, Sex, Cinema, and Censorship, from 2001, in which she primarily talks about free speech, but she views the money shot as a moment in film, perhaps more clearly than any other, that evacuates both the rational and the intellectual, and the narrative in favor of the emotional, the bodily, and the spectacular. And from this, I would like to bring the notion of the money shot as something that halts narrative and the progression of an argument. There is a rupture within the documentary storytelling. And that these shots exist in, at least partially, a separate spectacular representational mode. These scenes are viewed as nothing else. And I often consider these people crying in documentaries in a similar fashion. The tears by the speaking subject that then becomes the crying subject can sometimes then work as a support structure for a weakened index for the documentary media event. Now, with this, I mean that if we have doubts about a person, if we question what is being said or what is being shown, the fact that the subject loses composure, loses control, and starts crying usually leads to that we invest more faith into what is being presented to us. And of course, this is not obvious, as I will talk about in a second, that we respond to crying people quite differently, socially, professionally. Some of us might even have jobs that encounter crying people on a daily basis. And then, of course, having someone crying in front of you will make you respond quite differently. Most of us don't, however, and we have different reactions to this. But as soon as we are encountered by a mediated crying subject, we tend to invest more into it, and the camera wants us to. It lingers, it shows us the tears. In her essay, Film Bodies, Gender, Genre, and Excess, Linda Williams discusses what she terms as the body genre. It's a particular way of relating to film through an excess of emotions, right? A film experience not experienced, in your mind, but through your body, much like a roller coaster ride or something like that. Although her discussion focused on pornographic film, horror film, and the melodrama, which of course the pornographic film has the object's physical register of the spectator, but so does horror film. A horror film is not primarily viewed, with your mind. It registers in your stomach, in your body. Right? As does the melodrama, which in the 1950s was called the weepies. Of course, it's there to make you have this emotional outburst so that people within the cinema should, in a sense, also lose control and the crying, as an object of it. And that this body of film, the body genres, so to speak, have so much in common that they should be compared and discussed together. And of course, to this, I would like to add the documentary as a body genre. Now, this is not as an obvious a case as you might think. Documentary, as we know, usually tells us stuff in a more or less objective or more level-headed and cool-minded way. It informs us, what Nichols calls the discourse of sobriety, perhaps. And although that we are quite aware of, people like, for instance, Michael Moore that we saw earlier today, is this engaged, of course, and very much present person, and there's nothing objective or level-headed about his approach. But although I wouldn't necessarily claim that his films would be referred to as body genres, however, there are many documentaries that we primarily view and feel and experience with our physical selves as much as our rational selves. And these money shots, these crying subjects, introduces this moment, these moments that Linda Williams discusses in pornographic film, in horror film, and melodrama, also sips into the documentary, and we should acknowledge this, and in this case, this melodramatic imagination for the documentary film as well. So this, in many ways, is about the affect, that is, the complex, relations of emotions and how these ties into social conventions and culture, and how the embodiment of these manifests itself differently once we're on camera. These discussions of the money shot I also view in line with what we could perhaps call the performativity of the speech act. And this ties also together with what I meant with from talking heads to the speaking subject. That is, we view the individual speaking in a different manner. We bring more theoretical and cultural analysis into the speech act. Right? So by analyzing these crying people, we need to take more things in consideration. For instance, crying and gender. Here, as I touched upon earlier, the crying woman and child is somehow considered ordinary. Documentary film do not respond half as much to crying female subjects in film as they do male. A crying woman in documentary does not necessarily get the response with the close-up of the tear and the lingering shots of the crying subject, nor does it with children. Crying men, however, the crying man is seen as exceptional. There is a distinct gender difference between these, crying, speaking, sobbing subjects. Although this, of course, can be historically analyzed. We see them very rarely in documentaries from the 30s and 40s and 50s, while today it's much more common. So yes, times are changing and men cry in public in different ways, and people have spent some time talking about this as well. Crying politicians has become this moment of talking about what the tears mean. Is it real? How manipulative is this? In this case, when Obama gave a speech the same day that he had received the news that I think that his grandmother had passed away. And of course, a lot of people saw this as a great signature of his humanity and that he's a brave politician that would stand up and give this speech even though he was in this state. Well, of course, critics of Obama found this to be highly manipulative. And there were even very detailed discussions of the fact that he consciously did not wipe away the tears because he wanted the light to sort of shine in the tears. They wanted the cameras at this public hearing to see that he was crying because there were points to win. Right? So this has changed. Not much before that, Bill Clinton cried repeatedly throughout his administration years. He was, he's been the Paganini of the tear duct, as someone referred him to. And many of Clinton's crying sessions has been, heavily chastised for being manipulative, playing to the camera, playing to the media, that he's actually wiping tears that are not actually there, stuff like this. The crying public figure, the crying man in media, is not an easy and obvious subject. To have something, when we talk about the crying human being that we encounter and how we respond to that. If we're having an argument with our partner and one of them starts crying, that, in most cases, is the end of the argument. Who can continue an argument with someone who's crying, right? It stops the show. And when we're encountering, for instance, in a court of law, a witness on the stand that starts to cry, the proceedings are halted as well, but for other reasons, and these are very formally dictated. One, the witness might say things that are not true. The court decides. So here, the person in affect, in a sense, transcending these social norms, is not something that brings clarity and truthfulness to the court as far as they're concerned. Quite the opposite. The person is in such affect that they have lost control and can say stuff that he or she does not mean, or they might, remember things that were not there, etc. The crying subject is therefore an unreliable subject, right? But there's also another factor that goes into the court's decision. It has to do with once a person starts crying, we sympathize. So people in the courtroom that are supposed to engage with this subject critically fails to do so because of the fact that they're in such acute state of affect that they're crying, and therefore I can no longer criticize them the way I would otherwise. So the crying subject in a witness booth in court is very different from how the crying speaking subject works within documentary film. Here, it seems to signal absolutely the opposite. Right? Here, it anchors truthfulness. It tends to symbolize something that belongs to the real. It enforces all these mechanisms that the history of documentary film has already well established within our culture and society. I have no watch here, but I want to show you some clips and comment on them, a few film clips. First, I want to show you a clip from Rossi's film El Sicario. El Sicario is an interview film that takes place in one hotel room. The film lasts for 1 hour and 10 minutes. We never see anything outside this hotel room. The person being interviewed is a murderer. He was a hitman, a hired murderer for the drug cartels in Mexico for many years. And throughout the film, he discusses the way they go about torturing, murdering people, and how he feels about that, and how the murder is completely incorporated into the drug cartel's workings. Towards the end of the film, because he has now left his criminal life and tries to live a normal life, hence he wears a veil. His face is never present throughout the film. We always see him like this, dressed in black with a black veil in front, just a piece of cloth over his head. And he tells the camera of the time when he actually decided to leave and become a born-again Christian. I would like to play those few minutes.
Y oran por mí. En ese momento, al escuchar yo sus oraciones, se me nubló la vista. No sentí más que un calor muy fuerte y no supe. De repente caigo. Fueron momentos para mí cruciales, el no sentir nada más que mi cuerpo hervir, mi sangre hervir. No puedo explicar lo que estaba sucediendo. Mi llanto corría. No había papel que secara todo lo que salía de mis ojos. No había un pañuelo que secara todo ese llanto. Era tanto, y yo volteaba y quería levantarme, a reanimarme. No podía, el llanto me embargaba y yo no pude hacer nada durante todo ese día que duramos en esa iglesia. Fue llorar. Yo no supe qué pasó. Fueron 8 horas las que estuvimos ahí. Yo no supe qué pasó en esas 8 horas. Yo me dediqué a llorar, porque algo estaba pasando dentro de mí en esos momentos. Algo más fuerte que todo lo que sentían ahí. Algo que a lo que yo critiqué, a esas joterías, esas mariconadas, estaban pasando en mí. Yo estaba siendo parte de esas joterías. Yo estaba llorando como un niño. Yo me vi como un niño. Toda mi vida estaba pasando rápido. Desde niño, mi adolescencia, toda mi vida iba pasando. Cosas buenas veía yo que pasaban y pasaban. Recordé a mis padres, recordé mi infancia, recordé los momentos felices, recordé el circo, recordé a mi madre aún viva, recordé a mis hermanos gozándonos, recordé todo lo que había olvidado, recordé cada momento que había dejado por irme a servir a una persona que no valía la pena. Se me inundó mi corazón de dicha. Yo dije, ¿qué es esto? Esto es bueno, esto está siendo bueno. Me está haciendo liberarme de todo ese yugo, de toda esa carga que traía yo en mi lomo de años de estar bajo el yugo de los carteles, bajo el yugo de esas personas que me tenían aplastado con el pie en el cuello, dando órdenes. Esto me estaba liberando. Fueron momentos muy hermosos, fueron momentos que mi pasión se desbordó. Yo no sabía en ese momento todavía qué. Yo no sabía que él estaba llorando. Yo me daba cuenta que algo estaba sucediendo. Pasó al siguiente día, me dicen, si alguien quiere pasar a recibir al Señor, pásele. Fue automático. Yo no tuve que decir yo quiero. Yo me puse de pie y caminé hacia el frente. Llegué y hacer una pequeña oración, dije unas pequeñas palabras. Yo digo, sí, yo sí quiero. Yo sí lo quiero porque lo estoy sintiendo. Yo quiero pertenecer a esta familia. Yo quiero pertenecer a Él porque Él me acaba de dar algo que nadie me había dado, la satisfacción de recordar lo bello que es la vida, lo bello que es ser libre, lo bello que es estar con mis hermanos, con mi familia, con gozo, convivir.
This example to me is very clear in demonstrating what I mean in a movement from the talking head to the speaking subject. That what we have here is not some detached situation, and nor do we have just something that pays attention to what is actually being said. This is a subject in acute affect, right? It is registered in his entire body. It is a statement that is completely embodied, and that is also a speech act in this sense that is performed. It is not just uttered. It's not a linguistic statement. Right? And this is a way to, and by studying people in affect or people crying, this is one of the ways that this becomes even clearer and draws attention to what goes on, even in more or less normal interview situations as well. What is typical for the Il Sicario film is also that we have just listened for little more than an hour in this film at this point to him describing very coolly, with complete composure and steady voice, how they sometimes have to torture the person that they're going to kill for a long, long time, even though they do not want any information, for no other fact that the people that are going to find him, they want them to see that he was tortured before death. And he can go into detail how he does this. It is on the verge of what you can actually listen to. And all you're looking at is this person with a black piece of cloth over your head. So this is a very interesting speaking subject for someone like me. It is also interesting that when he comes into this state of affect, of crying, is when he talks about crying. He talks about he is remembering a moment when he was in that church and this came over him. And this is when he sort of loses his control. So not only is he in the moment losing this control, producing this sort of money shot sequence, but he's also reenacting another time when the same happened to him. I also want to show some more clips. Okay, let's see. I want to show a clip from Hearts and Minds, Peter Davis' film about the Vietnam War in 1974, in which he interviews a series of people. The film, Hearts and Minds, has as one of its central themes the notion that many of the American militaries, of commanding militaries, perceived of what they call the Oriental, which is their term, had no sense of humanity, that they suffer less than Europeans and Americans, and that they do not place value on human life, and therefore they do not grieve and feel sorrow. That's why they're a difficult opponent, etc. So the fact that showing people in great affect is one of the things that Peter Davis does. Here's an interview with a pilot from the American Army.
When I was there, I never saw a child that got burned by napalm. I didn't drop napalm, but I dropped other things just as bad. I dropped CBUs, which can't destroy anything. It's meant for people. It's an anti-personnel weapon. We used to drop canister upon canister of these things with 200 tumbling little balls in there about this big around, with something like 600 pellets in each ball that would blow out as soon as they hit the ground and shred people to pieces. They couldn't be gotten out in many cases. People would suffer. They would live, but they would suffer, then often they would die afterwards. And this would cause people to have to take care of them, But I look at my children now, and I don't know what would happen if, what I would think about if someone napalmed.
Do you think we've learned anything from all this?
I think we're trying not to. I think I'm trying not to sometimes. I can't even cry easily. From my manhood image. I think Americans have tried, we've all tried very hard to escape what we've learned in Vietnam, to not come to the logical conclusions of what's happened there. The military does the same thing, They don't realize that people fighting for their own freedom
are not going to be stopped by just changing your tactics, you know.
So what we see in this interview is a person that first starts out by telling us what he has done that is horrible. And he speaks to us in a very direct manner, a direct voice. He's, in a sense, within his controlled, composed self, talking about what he did during the war, the type of weapon that he, anti-personnel bombs that he dropped, etc. And when he returns to what he would consider if someone had dropped these bombs on his children, for instance, and hence sort of his private self takes over, and his sort of involuntary bodily response to these, the thoughts gets played out in front of the camera. And he talks about, again, he comments on his crying, the fact that he has a difficulty of crying because of his manhood image, he says. And there's a long pause. And we just sit and watch this man struggle with holding back the tears, and the fact that he's feeling the pressure to do just that, holding back the tears, also creates this intense drama. It also creates and profoundly affects our relations to what is being said. A person that just admitted to having dropped bombs on children in Vietnam, we now sympathize with, because obviously he's sad about it. And what he said prior now gets, reinterpreted, reviewed through this emotional display. And then, of course, he finds his footing again, and the interview continues, and his voice is back, his proper voice. From the same film, I also want to show, let's see if I can find that. It should be here somewhere. There it is. Daniel Ellsberg is here talking about what could have been if Robert Kennedy had not been shot at the Ambassador Hotel, and perhaps much suffering and people killed could have been avoided. And when he recounts that day when Robert Kennedy was shot, is what we're going to see.
From the Ambassador Hotel, got into a car. We were struck with how easy it was to get onto that floor and to approach him at that point. At the conference on lessons of Vietnam, of course, in the morning, I learned that Robert Kennedy had died. Well, that was a way for a lot of people to feel powerless. So it began to look as though there was no way.
Introduced this clip, it said that he is here talking about what could have been. All that was missed because Robert Kennedy was shot and could not pursue his politics. He actually mentions this very, very briefly. This is something that I infer. I infer this into this interview for no other reason because of his display, right? The grief that he is feeling is not only the loss of his friend, Kennedy, but it's also the grievance of what could have been as far as politics go. So the crying, performing, embodied and affected speaking subject speaks to us also. It conveys information. So this is why, another example of why perhaps we should talk about speaking subject instead of talking heads. I have one last clip. It's from Mohsen Makhmalbaf, the Iranian filmmaker, his Salam Cinema. He put out an ad in a paper in Tehran and said, please come audition for my latest film. And thousands of people showed up, wanted to be part of his film. The thing is that he was not going to make a film. The film he was going to make was this auditioning and nothing more. So he wanted to see what people were able to, what they would put themselves through to be in a film. So this is almost like a psychological or social cultural experiment. And I'm going to show you a short clip from that. It's also about the director as a dictator and many things.
همه بخندین 30 ثانیه وقت دارین گریه کنید. سکوت. هر کی اشکش در اومد واسه بقیه به سرعت بدون برن، خودشون بدونن که ردن. روتون به من. هر کی گریهش نمیاد بدوه بره و درم ببنده. سر بالا ببینمتون. بعد اشکتون درادا. برین دیگه. هر کی گریه نکرد بدوه بره. برین دیگه. بابا هر کی گریه نکرد رد بره. وقت نداریم، خیلی تو صفحه. بریم. سینما باید گریه و خندت همین دم دستت باشه. کات.
اشک فکر نمی‌کنم با هر چقدر از ته دلم که بخواید گریه کنید بتونی بیاریش بیرون، ولی دیگه تا اون حدی که تونستید.
آقایون بفرمایید، واقعا رد شدید. ما از بس جمعیت زیاد شده دیگه نمیرسیم امتحان بکنیم. هر کی گریه کرد نگه می‌داریم، هر کی نکرد بره. ما اصلا واقعا فرصت نداریم، داریم کار میکنیم. جانم همونجا بگو.
یکی از آقایونی که اینجا اومد نشست از دوستان خود شما، بگید بیاد اینجا بخنده و بلافاصله گریه.
ما هنرپیشه نداریم متاسفانه. آقای زینالزاده بلند شو اونجا واسه گریه کن ببینم. همینجا واسه گریه کن ببینم. شما هم بیا واسین. بیا واسین. واسه بغلش. شما واسه بغل آقای زینالزاده شما. نه واسین بغلش. پس برید همون عقب واسین. همونجا واسین. 30 ثانیه بعد وقت میدم آقای زینالزاده. اگه گریه کردی
نه تو نور نگاه نکن آقای زینالزاده. آقای مخمل بافو نگاه کن.
منو نگاه کن گریه.
آقای مخمل بافو.
یک 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10
ما 2 ثانیه 1 ثانیه
11 همین الانش در اومده. نمیخوایم بریم؟ همین الان اشکش در اومده دیگه. میخوایم این چک کنید هر کی اشک دید بره دیگه.
And then, of course, the other people that were there for the audition starts crying, but those because they failed, but those tears didn't count because they were real. He needed fake tears. And the notion of the faked tear as something that is very useful and necessary within fiction film, which is completely deplorable within the documentary, which is perhaps exemplified by a fiction film in the film Broadcast News from 1987, which is about making, investigative journalism for television. We see William Hurt play a character, a reporter, that while interviewing a rape victim, later in editing, fakes crying. So that when the actual show is broadcasted, there's a cut to him interviewing him, and he has tears running down. And it's interesting to see how people within broadcast then responded very positively to this, that he is a man of conscience, he is empathetic, he has all these positive qualities. And then they found out that the crying was fake. And the breach of contract, this violation of social rules that faking crying meant was also instructive. But the importance of tears is enforced throughout fiction continuously. It is in films like Pretty Woman, for instance, when Richard Gere takes the prostitute, played by Julia Roberts. And she is a fun-loving kind of good character, but she's not, properly a real woman, a real person, until he sees her cry at the opera, and the camera lingers on the tears rolling down her cheek. It's all important that we understand and we see that Richard Gere sees the tears and understands. Right? So there is within fiction also many aspects that reinforces our understanding of what crying is, what crying can do, and what crying can purvey in form of information. I have one last comment, and it's, let's see if I can find my footing here again. There's a scene from one of William Shakespeare's plays, Richard II, in the second act and the second scene, in which the queen is very upset, in what I would call then acute affect, that the king is leaving and leaving her alone in the castle. And she has all this, terrible scenarios that what now is going to happen to the king and what's going to happen to her. Then a dialogue between her chambermaid, Bushy, takes place, in which Bushy has this small monologue and tells the queen that she's looking awry and talks about the tear, looking through the tear as something that both clarifies and distorts simultaneously. While certain things becomes clearer, you see things as you've never seen them before because you are crying. But on the other hand, because the tear is convex, she uses this metaphorically, things get distorted and viewed through this sort of liquid lens of the tear. And of course, this dialogue is drawing attention to many of the things that I tried to discuss in this money shot discussion as well, that there are many complex aspects that goes into taking part of the testimony of someone in acute affect. Now, I would like to make a brief summary here as well. William Haddon, the writer, talks a lot about what he calls the human traits, and talking about the person crying as someone that you can get mad at for forcing humanity out. Haddon talks about encountering, his version of encountering the crying subject as something that does not invoke necessarily empathy and sympathy, but anger towards this person for forcing him to feel these things. I did not come here expect to be troubled by this. You're haunting me with your tears. And concludes this discussion by saying that wetness is the sign of humanity. And here he talks about tears, but this could, of course, be extended to then, I guess, for the money shot purpose, all bodily fluids. And I also think about the debate between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy, which the debate was one of the first televised political debates. And the fact that Nixon, who had a cold, was sweating profusely. He was just wet. Plus, he had a heavy beard, so he had a 5 o'clock shadow. It was aired at night. So here's was this unshaven, super sweaty man, and people could only focus on this, his body in volition, again, something that is escaping what is being said. He is performing himself through his body. While Kennedy, of course, was just healthy, cool, unsweaty, shaven, and he was sympathetic. People listen differently depending on that. So this could also, if we want to extend this to this, how the body performs while the subject is speaking, to also be understood in a way as a money shot. I think I'm going to conclude there. Thank you for listening.
Do you want to sit down for a while? Yes. Okay. Now, there is a time and a possibility to ask questions to Patrik. Maybe you can start with one question. If you just sort of summarize it in a different way. When you do interviews, and I always have sort of the practical perspective, and you do interviews, content is not important. The body is important. Is this what you would agree upon?
Well, I would think, do I need this?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Is this good?
Yes.
Well, I think that perhaps we might take the wrong turn if we really try to separate the two. And I think that this realization that when we listen to people talking, we're also watching them talk in many different ways. And we talk with our bodies. We do that in regular life as well. And the affected person also means that we take in other considerations because, you know, we have personal agendas. We might only tell part of the truth. We might be stressed out. We might be lying. We might be very unreliable narrators of what we're actually talking about, whether it's in an Errol Morris film or something else. And this, of course, are played out in the body. So yes, we're listening to what is being said, but the body is also communicating many things to us. And this breaking of the mold, which I think when the money shot effect sort of appears, that when the body takes over, when the situation sort of calls up this other voice. Daniel Ellsberg's voice is like he's someone else. When he talks about Robert Kennedy, his voice sounds like from another person all entirely.
Now you talked about the body genre. Do you see throughout film history, when you look at documentary film history, periods or a period where this was more the case, you know, the tendency towards body expression, or is this pretty much a stable part of the history?
I guess there are certain types of filmmaking that would provoke more of those bodily responses. If we see, you know, more of a confrontational style of cinema verité in which, you know, someone who's making a film is confronting someone in the street and saying, "Are you happy?" And of course, the person is going to respond in many different ways as opposed to a prepped, you know, interview situation when, you know, someone is an expert and answering questions as an expert, of course. So films that will have that agenda. But also, I think films that will have a witness component. For instance, people are witnessing about atrocities being made or experiences of war. I mean, the subject of the film itself will call up much more emotional aspects of people talking, of course, as opposed to if we watched a film about, you know, how black holes are created in space. People are not, you know, as emotionally attached to that.
There's just one film that comes to my mind when I listen to what you said, and that's The Act of Killing, because the body has a completely different language than what actually people want to say in certain scenes. Now, reenactment, bringing people like in situation where they live through certain emotions, seems to be an important aspect of bringing up bodily reactions.
Oh yeah, and any reenactment will again, I mean, as we saw from El Sicario, when he's sort of reenacting, when emotions are brought to the fore again, perhaps in an unexpected, I mean, he seems to be surprised by his own reaction and the state he finds himself in, you know. So there is this involuntariness of what I refer to as the money shot here, and it is this unplanned aspect of the interview, of the speaking subject, that gives it credibility, in a sense, which is also what makes it manipulative.
Yeah.
So it's this, yeah.
We have 2 microphones. Are there any questions? And is somebody volunteering to bring the microphones? Any questions around? Now, from a practical perspective, if you look at it, money shots, you know, it's like a negative term. I do something just in a capitalist goal to reach more audience, to reach more. It has that negative. Do you see that aspect only as a negative aspect, or is it just me?
Well, I use it in the same sense as Laura Grindstaff does, but of course she has picked it quite deliberately, because these talk shows, of course, is a form of a lowbrow culture. what is shunned and looked down upon, much as pornography is as well. So I think for her it's very idiosyncratic. But on the other hand, I don't use it necessarily negatively. I use it as a term to put focus on a particular thing. Mm-hmm. But no, I don't put that much value to it.
Back there.
Patrik, I have a question that's not very theoretical, but because we talk about emotions, can you tell us something, because we have you here now, personal, why you chose this moment in film? Is there any big cry in your life that's behind your research?
Why I'm preoccupied with people crying in film? Yeah, there could be reasons for that I don't even know myself. I should be humble to that as well, I guess. But I guess I don't have any, exciting answer to that. It became one of the things that I became interested in when I tried to sort of resituate the speaking subject in documentary media. I wanted to talk about and find things that I thought was important to talk about and which very little was written on. And this is why I gravitated towards crying people, in the same sense that I talk about people hiding their faces and stuff, because I think it, pinpoints certain theoretical and perhaps technological aspects of documentary filmmaking. And yeah, since documentary fills so many functions in our lives, then they consist of so many speaking subjects, of people talking, saying things to us, then I thought these people in great affect also speaks things to us, but in a different way. So to my mind, I have no great revelation to convey personally. I wish I did. I don't.
Marcy's over there.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation and all the examples. I would like to get back to the question of the performance and the involuntary or voluntary aspect of it. In terms of Bill Nichols, he does make a distinction between the kind of participatory interactive approach and something that really is performative, where someone is really staging something particular for the film. And when I look at the examples that you showed, and I think of other examples as well, when Daniel Ellsberg cries or when the soldier cries, I do have the feeling that it really is involuntary. They're trying to tell a story and they're overcome by their emotions. When the hitman in the Mexican film cries, I have a very different sense that he is kind of whipping himself up into a state where he wants to cry as a kind of performance. And it ties into the performance of self-pity of the perpetrator that we see in a lot of films. And we're seeing it right now, if I may say, I think also in the Oscar Pistorius trial, where someone who's actually on trial for being a perpetrator considers himself the victim, feels sorry for himself, and tries to make himself cry, or gets into this kind of histrionic opera situation. And I think I would make a distinction between those categories, and I'm wondering if you do as well. I think the act of killing, of course, would be an example of this too.
Absolutely, but I think that from the Il Sicario example, the fact that when he is reenacting a scene before he actually becomes this acutely affected, so he has already gone into this mode of recreating that pivotal moment in his life when he chose to give up his life as a criminal and as a murderer. So he's already in this state of telling us what it was like. He's already on his knees and telling us about how he was crying, what was happening around him, how he first thought the people crying around him were ridiculous. But as he progresses within this already performative mode, he then encounters, of course, this affect. This is what comes up to him. So he does not encounter affect in the sense that Daniel Ellsberg does, that he's sitting there having a reasonable interview dialogue with someone and then is overcome. So he is already somehow displaced, which is, of course, what happens in many of the cases in the act of killing as well, when they're overcome by the situation of reenacting their own murders, so to speak. But yes, I clearly make that distinction as well.
Thanks.
I have another question. Editing films sometimes.
Can you use the microphone for the...
That if you have somebody crying, the effect can be that you laugh as a spectator. So crying in cinema is something very dangerous. Sometimes it just is the opposite effect, instead of crying in real life.
I agree. I mean, it is... I'm making some general assumptions of what happens when we watch people crying, because we're all different, and we're all, I mean, in every case is slightly different. But the insistence with which documentary filmmakers almost exclusively keep these sequences. Why do they keep them? These long sequences of people just battling to keep their composure. Why keep it? You're at the editing table. There's a million things you can do. Almost all of them keep them, and you should ask yourself, why is that? It's because it speaks to us. And it conveys meaning. It puts us in a different mode of the argument presented. So if you're making a film about a very argumentative documentary in which your point of view is very important, perhaps if you're interviewing a person that you clearly do not like and whose point of view you find horrible, if they find themselves in affect and starts crying, that crying might be easier to cut out, because you do not want to create sympathy for that character, because that's what you might run the risk of doing, regardless of what is being said by that character. Again, remember the soldier who just confesses of bombing all these children with these horrible weapons, and then starts crying and somehow winces over.
Crying is one thing, fighting not to cry is another thing. I think that's even stronger, isn't it?
Oh, well, it certainly also informs us about how crying is viewed. When the Elfsberg's fighting his tears and his choking up, his voice becoming completely different, and his breathing is differently. He's fighting with his body. He's fighting with sort of what is trying to come up. And of course, all the Bill Clinton sequences that could have shown, many crying Clintons, for instance, and he's fine with that.
Yeah.
So he's not fighting his tears, so to speak.
He knows how to capitalize on it.
Yeah.
So, okay, I think this is... Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
Thank you very much. A lot of the words about the speaking subjects, which we're using in documentary, like the witness, confession, testimony, are words which have been previously religiously connotated. And we see also this connection in the Mexican film. Have you also been thinking about this connection to the pop culture?
In the religious aspect.
The religious aspects which are in culture, both about crying and about like making confession in public. Also because one of the oldest autobiography that is called The Confession, and deals also with the self today, speaking about his previous self and seeing himself now different, probably would also cry if it would be a film.
I have not thought about the cultures of public crying that exist within the religious community as that. I have written some about what is referred to as ecstatic speech, which come from ecstasy, from Greek's ekstasis, which means standing beside oneself, hence ecstasy. And ecstatic speech comes from speaking in tongues, which in a sense is religious, that it is your voice, but it's not your voice. You're in a state of affect in which you're saying stuff that you would normally not access, right? So there is this dualness within that speech act that is also, of course, performed dramatically and with lots of affect as well. So, but I think that's a good comment to consider other religious contexts as a place, a safer place in which it's okay to cry in public. Sports is like that too. People, men cry in sports all the time, but it's okay.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have one question about the truth of tears. Have you, the oldest example you showed us is quite old, I don't know, 30s or 40s, and it was a fiction film, and yet we have a strange distance to the way the worker was crying there. I didn't really true. It was nice acted, but and the woman in the film, she takes it as a complete truth. If you look at younger examples, the most probably or the most important, the most clicked music clip on YouTube of last year starts with a crying face, which makes it very close to us. It's Wrecking Ball with Miley Cyrus, where we see her tears drawn. It's completely fake, and yet it touches the viewer. Apparently, it works very well. It sells well. It's a good selling point. Or Sandra Bullock's tear, even in Gravity, flies towards us when we see her in space. So it's a complete, a tear would never do that. It's complete fakeness. Have you, in documentary films, on your research, found a historical development where techniques or film techniques have to adapt to our look at tears, at the truth of a tear?
Well, let's try to answer those. I think that are you firstly referring to the clip that I showed from the Phantom Chariot, the old film clip?
Yes.
Well, this is from 1920. So it's very old. And of course, at this point, melodrama as a genre was barely existing. And of course, but if we read reviews of Victor Sjöström's film, it is all about, how it completely enraptured the audience and how they were people crying in the audience. But it is also, the way that scene is constructed is about his emotional state and about the crying man, which in 1920, as we should, historize this, properly, was not something that was screened in public. But also, if you see documentaries from 30s and 40s, you continuously run into that situation, which I mentioned with your comment, where the editor protects the dignity and the integrity of the speaking subject by turning the camera away or editing out the crying subject, because that is not something that we should be exposed. That is too private, too much, so to speak. But as history changes us and society changes, so does, of course, our relation to emotional, public displays of emotion. So today it's completely okay in many aspects to cry in public. And documentary works reflect that change too. I don't know, I hope that answered some part of your question.
Sure, and business has taken over the knowledge of this development too, apparently.
I mean, there are shows like, what's it called? Extreme Home Improvement, and these, when they come into these poor families' lives and send them off to Disneyland for a week and then rebuild their house so their life will be better. It's completely organized around the way and the moments that these people will cry. They will be crying in the beginning because they're destitute. They'll be crying at Disneyland because they're at Disneyland. And they'll be crying at the end of that 25-minute show because their house is rebuilt and it's wonderful. And the camera cannot get enough. And we have many shows like this that is completely organized around these social actors' emotional display of them losing their control in front of the camera.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have to come to an end because lunch break is waiting and the program will go on later on. We will be back here at 1:30. 13:30 Uhr geht es weiter. Patrik, thank you again for sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you.